Welcome to Season 2 of Conscious Conversations, where we aim to inspire deep and meaningful interactions that grow into a community of practice that is committed to healing, resilience, and expansion. In this season, our focus is on Africa, the fountain of humanity, the great Mother Africa, a land research is increasingly confirming to be home of the first humans to evolve. Research also confirms that early humans migrated out of Africa into Asia about 2 million years ago and into Europe about 1.5 million years ago. The long and short of it, Africa is where it started. In this season's Conscious Conversations, we speak with spiritual teachers and thought leaders about the ways in which we can unearth the wisdom of the old that calls us back to listen, learn, remember, restore, and heal. I am Mabato Monte. Welcome. Family constellations as an area of research can be found in modern psychology and in indigenous ancestral reverence practices of the Nguni people. Family constellations is therapy based on the belief that energy, both negative and positive, can be found in familial bonds and can manifest as patterns of mental health concerns, illness, and potentially destructive behaviors within families. In this conversation, we speak to Ryan Klette about how constellations can be applied as an intervention in resolving issues around identity crisis, anxiety, and in depression for individuals and in communities. Ryan has had a lifelong interest in spirituality and psychology, what it means to lead a happier and healthier life. This led him to travel to Brazil and India in his 20s, learning about altered states, and later on to study psychology. He has participated in 5 vision quests, his final quest being 13 days. He has spent significant time being present to his own system and continues to practice daily. He holds a master's degree in psychology. He is a Tiny Habits certified coach, Enneagram facilitator, Family Constellations practitioner, and a social and emotional intelligence certified coach. That's an interesting introduction. Good morning, Ryan. Thank you so much for being with us this morning.
Good morning, Mbato.
Your life seems very interesting. Do you want to share with us a little bit about yourself, how you started your journey and where you are at right now as a Family Constellations practitioner and I suppose as a citizen as well?
Yeah, so shall I go kind of way back in the beginning?
Yes, please.
Well, I would say what led me to this path is actually a feeling of being lost. I was in my 20s and I was in a place where I was quite, kind of confused about my life and about where I was going with my life. And that's why I went to India. That's why I traveled to India when I was about 28. Because I was looking for some kind of a solution, because I always had this feeling that there was something missing. You know, I always had this feeling that there was more, and I was in quite a corporate job, and I was kind of in the rat race, and very uncomfortable in it. My health had taken a toll, and I wasn't doing well. You know, and on virtually any level, I wasn't doing well. Physically, I wasn't doing well. Emotionally. So I was looking for some kind of a solution. And at that stage, we were big into enlightenment. You know, everyone was talking about enlightenment. So, India seemed like the place to go to get this enlightenment. And, I kind of got tricked into that enlightenment business. And, it didn't work out at all. It didn't work out at all. I went to India and, got anything but enlightened. But I did start a journey, right? I did start kind of a path, and India opened quite a lot up for me, I'd say, because one of the things that happened in India is I started to recognize that I love to dance. And I found that in some of the ashrams there, I started to realize how much I enjoyed just getting in the body and moving. And that was something that became a big passion of mine. And India actually led me to Brazil. Okay. I met someone in India, and she actually, through yoga, in fact, she said, come and do some yoga in Brazil. And that didn't work out. And then I stayed in Brazil, and then I got interested in the Brazilian traditions, and in some of the medicine paths in Brazil. And that opened up something else for me. So one thing led to another. But what I started out looking for certainly wasn't what I got in the end. In fact, I came back from Brazil the first time, and someone said to me, like, well, what did you get from it? And, you must have got something. And I felt like I just lost a lot. I felt like, it wasn't like this idea of getting something. It was more a feeling of losing something.
Losing in a sense of shedding? 'Cause sometimes we tend to think we are losing. In actual fact, I don't believe that we ever really lose anything that is of value in our lives. We might shed off material stuff. We might change in terms of our physical appearance, what we used to look like, and so on. But I found that through my own personal journey, that the more we seek the more we change our minds, the more we actually find more.
Yes, yeah.
It's just not tangible. You can't really touch it, hold it. But there's definitely more that we sort of like get renewed somehow.
Yes, yeah. I think for me it was a losing of a belief system, a perspective, a way of thinking maybe. I think that was what was changing for me. So that when I came back, certainly I had a long way to go, but I'd lost an orientation, a kind of a fixation, I guess. And I was more, I would say, receptive, and probably more just humbled by life, not thinking that I had it all worked out. So yeah, I like what you say. Yeah, that makes sense to me.
And that's the beauty about the spiritual journey, right? The more we think we know, as you get deeper into the journey, the more you realize that you don't know. And yes, it does come with a strong sense of humility.
Yes, yeah.
And I think that's enlightenment. So I would say you definitely started getting your enlightenment because you lost all these perceptions and these ideas that weren't necessarily yours.
Yes.
Perhaps it was the framing of the society you grew up in, and now you kind of like had to reorientate yourself and reevaluate and figure out what your values actually are.
Yes, yeah, that's a good way to look at it. Yeah, I think I was also becoming more aware of my condition, right? Like in what you're saying now, my condition related not just to my personal life, but the condition that I was brought up in, the world that I was brought up in, the society that I came from, my culture, all those forces that shaped me. I started to become much more aware of that as well. So I guess it's about awareness. Yeah.
And what got you into Family Constellations?
Family Constellations was quite a lot further, in fact, because I got back when I was just early 30s. So that then I stopped traveling so much. I still traveled a bit, but not as much as I had been. And then I started studying psychology, and that was maybe 6 years. And then after that, I became interested in family constellations because my mom actually is a constellator. Oh. So it's in my family. And so I'd done family constellations for a long time. But the way that they were doing it back in the early days was a little bit more laborious. This was just my mother's generation, because this is how the family constellation started. It started, you could say, in a less intuitive way, I would say. And it's become more fluid over time. So it's changed like anything else. So when I started Family Constellations, in that generation from my mother's constellators, it was very different back then. So I wasn't that interested in it. It could feel quite tedious. You could sit for 6 hours in constellations the whole day, and you'd come out of it feeling, or I'd come out of it feeling quite, quite drained from it. Whereas, when I became interested in it, it had changed quite significantly. And our teacher was from Brazil, And he did it in shorter kind of sessions, which for me made quite a lot more sense. And it was actually, it was more intuitive. So we weren't, we weren't putting ourselves so much in the field. We were more just witnessing the movements and doing much less. And I think that's, that's changed for most constellators these days, is that I think people tend to realize that that's one of the things that we've learned as constellators, is not to do too much in the field, but rather to let the field speak for itself and to follow the movements that come.
And so for our listeners who might not be familiar with what constellations are, can you just take us through what family constellations are?
Yes, it's a big question. So I think the first way to describe family constellations is to first think about this idea of the morphic field. And Rupert Sheldrake is a good one to look up if you want to know more about that. But it's the kind of thing that you can't really describe so well. It's not something that makes rational sense. And the best way that I've learned to describe it is to refer to something like, if there's, for instance, a car accident, what you'll find is that often the days after an accident, people still veer around the space of the accident. There's still a sense of what happened in that space. So traffic often slows down, or even though the accident's not there anymore, people still have a sense, there's a felt sense that we can tap into, that something happened. So that's what we refer to as the morphic field, is that we can feel, we can sense into a space, and that there's a memory that we can access. So family constellations is really about, in some way opening to that memory and learning to work with that memory. And you can do that anyway. We can work in organizations, we can work in families, and it's just about bringing balance to a field. So the idea with family constellations is that the field itself has a consciousness, has a kind of an awareness, you could say. And the field, or the collective, was always interested in the collective and the system's balance. So a system doesn't prioritize any one person within that system. A system prioritizes the system itself. So we're looking to balance the system. And as we balance the system, all the members in that system can come into a kind of you could say, a relief. They can find their own way of balancing within that collective. So when we're looking at a constellation, we're not looking at if you think of Western psychology, it's very much like the focus is on the individual, and the responsibility is given to the individual. Like, him or her did this or that, and we make it, that it was their choice. Whereas when we look at a system, we look at the context. So we look at what promotes that kind of choice, what gives birth to the behaviors within that field. So it's a very different way of looking at any kind of an issue, because we see that it arises, there's always a context, it always arises from something. And if we work with the system, then what tends to happen is that the people in the system get benefit from that. So we can talk about that just now, but we work with what Bert Hellinger, who's the founder of Family Constellations, calls the orders of love. And the orders of love are just like, you could say, guidelines into like how love flows, like how we get health in these systems.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because as I've been doing research and preparing for this conversation, I read about the orders of love. Yes. Although I hoped that would talk about that a bit deeper when we are deeper into the conversation. But I think because it's come up, let us dig into that. I looked at the orders of love, and there were 4 that struck or stayed with me, and they can also be referred to as the unwritten laws, when one is doing a constellations, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. One of them is parents give and children receive, and then everybody has a place within the family, no matter what. And there needs to be a balance of giving and asking. It says those who come first in the system have got priority. And that made me think about ancestral healing and why it's important that we observe those hierarchical relationships. And it also made me wonder how the founding father of Family Constellations, how his influence, or rather the influence that he got from the Nguni people, because I believe he lived in Natal as a missionary, and he learned quite a bit from how the Nguni people were practicing ancestral reverence. How do you think, number one, how do you think his experience in Natal with the Nguni people influenced the methodology? And then can you just take us a bit deeper into those orders of love?
Yes, that's a really good foundation. Well, let's start with the orders of love, right? Because I think that's a good place to start. You said it almost perfectly, I think, that to simplify it, to make it easy for people to remember. You could just say that you could simplify them to 3 orders of love. So, and they're quite intuitive, and I'd encourage your listeners as we are speaking to also feel into their bodies, as we're talking about this, because often just talking about this material can bring things up, right? Because it can remind us of ways that we've forgotten these orders. So the first order is inclusion, which means that everyone belongs. And that's regardless of what you've done. So that there's no exception. Everyone belongs. Your place is never threatened. You always have a place. Although we can feel like we don't belong, we always belong. And so what we find in Family Constellations is that some of the difficulties that people experience are directly related to belonging. Because where there's exclusion, and you might even just feel into that word exclusion, when you've felt excluded, what that feels like in your body. It's one of the most difficult things I think we can feel, because belonging is so primal in a way to us as a species. We need it. It's everything. Our belonging is our way of survival in a way. So if we don't feel like we belong, it can cause many problems. So where people have been excluded from systems, that sets up a pattern. So that's the first order. And it's very common for us to, not just in our family systems, but in life in general, to in some way exclude people, to feel like, no, not them. They don't deserve it, so we kind of push them away. And in doing that, we're setting up a pattern. So that's the first order. And if you want to practice that order, you can just look at your family and just feel into, your family system, whether it's your parents, or if you're married, your wife and your kids and your relatives, and you just affirm them, you belong, I see you, you belong. And just that statement, I see you and you belong, and you hold that in your heart, just that is, I find quite a healing statement. The second order is sequence. So sequence is like what you were saying, that everyone has a sequence. So I'm the older brother. So I was first born. My brother came after me. That can never be changed. I'm always going to be the older. He's always going to be the younger. And my parents are bigger. I'm smaller, so that's the idea of sequence. They came before me. So I have to honor my parents. And then how that gets tripped up, you could say, in a system. In my case, for instance, my dad left when we were quite young, and I kind of stepped into that place for my father. And so I stepped out of my sequence as the son, and I stepped into a role that wasn't mine to play, but I did it for belonging. So, and we do these things for love. We do these things for belonging. And as a result, again, that sets up a new kind of a pattern that you've got to work with. So it's, whenever we talk about these things, we never need to, blame ourselves or feel bad about things, it's just, we look at that's the best we could do at that time. And we're looking now in a new moment. How do we work with what we did in the past, and how do we get more creative, and how do we let go of those roles that weren't ours to carry? So sequences, and often it's common among siblings, that siblings step out of sequence. The younger wants to be the older, whatever the case is, the middle one that's not comfortable in the middle. So there's often kind of a rivalry between siblings that can happen. But when everyone has their right place in the system, there's a kind of a settling that can happen. And in companies, it's very common. So like, for instance, someone who's quite new to a company and he gets a fancy job or fancy title. He's the new sales manager, or he's the, whatever the fancy job is. But he's the newest in the system, but because he's got the role that is a priority for that organization, then what tends to happen is that he doesn't honor everyone who's come before. And there's a whole system of people, there's a whole number of people who come before him. So the right movement for him to do, or her to do, is to honor those that have come before, and for him to take his right place within that sequence. So in terms of the time sequence, he's the last, even though he's got this fancy job. He's actually the last. And if he doesn't honor that sequence, again, that can set up a pattern, and can set up unnecessary difficulties, because it doesn't need to be, it can be harmonized. These systems can be harmonized. And that's better for everyone, including the guy who's got the fancy job. Then, the last one is so I did inclusion, I did sequence, and then giving and receiving. So giving and receiving is just, it's very natural for us to want to give, and we also need to receive. So when one person is giving too much, another person is not able to receive, it sets up a particular kind of dynamic, because when you are giving, there's a kind of a lightness, right? Because you give and you feel like there's a lightness that comes with that. You could also, Bert Hellinger described that as innocence. And when you receive, you feel a little heavier, right? There's kind of a guilt that comes with that. So you feel like, and it's a good guilt. We should carry that guilt. So the natural movement is to reciprocate, to give back. And then there's this, and that's how you build a relationship, right? Because, you give a little, you receive a little, and you keep on this kind of exchange. Yeah. So and then also when we're tuned into it, we're giving at the right time and we're receiving at the right time, because there's often patterns. We can talk about the Enneagram later, but there's a particular kind of personality. It's a personality type that tends to give too much. And then as a result of giving too much, they push people away. Because what you're doing is you're making people around you too heavy. And because they aren't able to receive properly, then they kind of block the relationship. They get in the way of the relationship. So the only exception to that is obviously parents and children, because parents are always going to give more. And that's just the nature of life. So then it's for the child, for us as children, to either give on to the next generation, or to pay that debt back to life, to give back to life, because we can never repay our parents. Our parents we're always indebted to our parents. And that's the thing, regardless of what they did to us, what they didn't do to us, it's to come to that place of real gratitude for what they gave us, the life that they gave us, the fact that we here can have a conversation, we're healthy enough to, and we've got what they gave us is just, it's such a big
Incredible.
Gift, to receive that.
Yeah. And tapping into the influence of the Nguni people in this kind of work. As you know, I work with ancestral healing, and I can see how some of the principles, in fact, all three of these principles that you have spoken about, apply in the African context. So, for me, it's kind of clear that there was quite a big influence of how the Nguni people practiced ancestral reverence, or their belief system. Are you able to take us into that a bit?
Yeah, I mean, my sense of it is, and I must say that on the outset, as I don't actually know enough about Bert Hellinger's history to give you a proper answer, but my sense of it is that Bert Hellinger came from Germany. So he came from a very individual society, where the emphasis was placed on the person. And like I said, that's the Western condition, right? We put a lot of emphasis on the individual. And when he was with the Zulus, I mean, he must have learned so much, because now he was in a culture where everything was, we heal in the collective, Ubuntu, we heal together. And I think that's where he learned this method of constellating, is he recognized that these patterns don't just come from individuals, that they come from an ancestry, that they don't come out of nowhere, that they can be carried, that they can be passed on. And in that way, that if you really want to heal, You need to heal within a system. You need to heal within a collective. And yeah, I mean, his witnessing of all those rites and those rituals, of course, I mean, that's what gave birth to this work, to this form of this work.
I also read that family constellations display relationships, entanglements, as well as connections between parts of the system, such as people in a family, people in an organization, and I guess in a community. I think how our communities are right now, particularly in South Africa, there is so much violence. There are so many broken families. People are just not happy. You know, do you think there's an opportunity at a community level for family constellations to play a role in our healing? And what do you think that could look like?
That's a really big question. Before I get to that, and maybe before we to go into that, just to respond to what you were saying just now, which is that everything's represented, right? So, for instance, if any of those laws are broken and the love is stopped in any way, you know, if there's a transgression at some point, then that must be represented somewhere. And that's just the nature of life, right? So if there's a trauma, if there's something that happened, if there's a war, if there's any experience that we go through that isn't digested, in some way it's got to be represented further down the line. And that's the beauty about family constellations is that it says that someone will step in to represent that. So, for instance, like if there's an exclusion, so let's say someone had, and again, it's interesting because in different times people are excluded for different reasons. So let's say at some point there was an exclusion because someone was odd, had a mental health condition, was hospitalized, or, and was quite common, in the last century. People were often hospitalized because they had mental health conditions and given all kinds of difficult treatments, and families would often push them away, right? So those kinds of exclusions, what happens for the next generation, someone has to step in and reflect that exclusion, because that's the interest of the system. The system wants the balance, and so what the system needs is someone to go and represent that person that was excluded. So what that can mean is that someone can come in from a next generation and take on some of that pain, and not know where it comes from. But and the healing of that is to re-include that person who was excluded, so that person, the new generation person, doesn't need to carry that burden anymore. So we can really take care of our own inner system. Our family system may be a little bit more control, but then we start really losing that control as we go out. So if you're talking about community, what your question was, how do we influence community? Or
so how if we as individuals, for instance, were aware of family constellations, it means that we would be aware of perhaps the injustices that have happened at a family unit perspective, which obviously influences the behavior of people out there. So in community. So if the family system is broken, it means that the individuals of that family most likely have got issues, which is then reflected in the family and in their communities, right? Because if you feel like you don't belong, if you feel excluded, you will act out. And it will influence your everyday life. So my question was really how you think, or rather, do you think if we were more aware of how family constellations work at an individual level, it could also influence how we show up at a broader level, so in communities and so on?
Definitely. I mean, that's many people the people that I respect the most, and I follow the most, I try to read the most, are the authors that talk about responsibility, and taking responsibility for yourself, for your family, for the things that you've got control over. And I definitely agree with that. I think that if you take care of your own affairs, if you take care of as much as you can, your family affairs, the patterns in your family, what's yours to take care of, then when you bring yourself out into life, you're not bringing as many of those burdens with you. So you become more of a resource. And I think that's what we're trying to do, right? Is to bring more resource to life so that we can assist other people. And that's the power of constellations, is that it's helping us to see what we can't see. And that's I think where we get, real movement.
So I've done constellations with you guys, and I saw how I carried the patterns of my mom within her own family systems, in my own individuality and in my own internal system. But I wonder how many other individuals, well, I suppose because in the context of our population as South Africa, not many people do internal work, not many people would probably do family constellations, but it carries so much power because, you are able to really see it. And like you said, these emotions, the things that come up, it's just such an incredible experience. If one is talking to an ordinary family, for instance, and we might use an example of sexual trauma, historical sexual trauma in the family, or maybe drug abuse. How would you say, or in your experience, how have some of these historical traumas shown up like in today's unit, and how have family constellations been able to bring that to your patients' awareness?
Well, it's very difficult to generalize because the thing is it's different every time. So, I think if you take any trauma, how that shows up in a family and how that works through a family system it's going to vary from family to family. So if you get specific about, say, it's a sexual trauma, what you would do is you would try to trace that trauma, so obviously there's a victim, right? And someone has been at the other end of that abuse. But then the perpetrator, the abuser, we actually need to, in terms of the family constellations method, and this is going to sound a little bit crazy, but we need to include the abuser. So we need to see the abuser. We need to, in some way, even honor the abuser, not condoning the behavior, but seeing the person, and then tracking back. Well, get the context, because in some strange way, that was the best that he or she could have done. And that's the thing that doesn't feel so intuitive, because we have this kind of tendency to think that they should have done better. That why did they do this terrible thing? But when we look at the conditions of their life, and we find in their life it's the same pattern. They might have had a parent or someone that did something to them, and the conditions that kind of birthed their abuse onto the next person. So to interrupt that pattern, we have to stop the blame game. We can't keep blaming the abuser. We have to step out of the victim mentality. So again, it's not to condone what happened, and whatever that was, whatever the trauma was, we have to acknowledge that, of course, that was wrong, and we can definitely make a line in the sand what's right and what's wrong. But at the same time, we can still bring a compassion to even the abuser, because the abuser's in pain. That's the thing that we miss, is that the person giving the abuse, that person is in pain. It's not something that's in our nature to do, to be abusive. So where we see abuse, that's often a signal for trauma, and you look further back into the roots, and it's the same time, every time it's the same thing. You can track back, that there's something that happened to that person where they were left in the same position. They were left victimized. They were left abused in some way, and they didn't know how to deal with it. They didn't have the right support, and so it just gets perpetuated. And the idea with family constellations is to try to get more creative in these cycles, and to look for a different response, to look for a different way of handling it. And the first rule is to come back to inclusion, that everyone belongs, even the abusers. And you can take that really far. And it doesn't actually work excluding. It doesn't work pushing away. We've seen that time and time again. It's not to say that you shouldn't be angry, you shouldn't be upset, that you have to face your own emotions, right? So whatever the abuse was, you'll have to work through those emotions. But the end point is always to come back and to see the person that was doing the abuse, and to come back to a simple statement like, I see you, and to recognize that person's pain and to leave that person's pain with them, and to come back to your own life and what you can be responsible for.
So in a sense, Family Constellations has a lot to do with ancestral healing, because you go back, right, to observe.
Always. Because, that's, for me, it makes so much sense. Nothing comes out of nowhere. So that's the radical thing, is you actually can't blame anyone for anything. But you can hold them responsible. But no one, you go right back to the conditions of your life. You didn't choose your parents. You didn't choose your upbringing. You didn't choose the traumas that happened to you. We didn't wake up and go, put our hand up and say, yes, I want those. I want that abusive father. I want that mother that doesn't give me the attention that I need. I want those kids at school who bully me and call me names. And I want all these conditions in my life to shape me in these ways. That's just our destiny, right? That's what happens. But we can do something with that. We don't have to keep playing it in the same way. When we wake up and we relax the blame game and we start to go, okay, let's take a breath and see what we can do with all that material. Because the thing is, that material we can alchemize it. It's actually energy that gets stuck in the past.
I wanted to actually bring the energy part up, to say with ancestral healing, I've come to understand that a lot of it is energy.
Yeah.
So you can help us just understand family constellations a bit more in the context of ancestral healing, and how it is an alternative to people who are not necessarily comfortable with the traditional ancestral healing journey. Perhaps this is a bit softer. It's a bit more internal, less symbolism, less ritual in the normal sense. And I think it's a very introspective and reflective way that allows people to tap into what they really feel. So just please take us through how family constellations, ancestral healing, and where we are at as individuals can help us to break the patterns that are not very productive in our lives, or at least help us create the kind of relationships that we would prefer.
Well, in the simplest way, I think, and I'll speak a little bit from my experience as well, but in the simplest way, what Family Constellations helps us to do is to turn back towards our parents and to honor our parents, and to see the ways that we don't do that, to see the ways that we've turned away from them. So what Family Constellations is saying is that we can only receive our life through our parents. That's the only way to get our life. And obviously, as we're receiving life through our parents, we're not just receiving life through our parents, we're getting it through our ancestry. We're recognizing that behind us is a long line of grandmothers and grandfathers. And that ancestry is where we get our life energy. So if there are parts of us that don't want to accept our dad, or don't want to accept our mom, or push them away for whatever reason, what we're really doing is we're blocking life. So what Family Constellations is helping us to do is turn back towards them and to meet them and to be honest with ourselves and to say, well, actually, you know what? Even though I don't like to admit it, I'm a lot like my mom. I'm a lot like my dad. And especially in the ways that I don't want to be like them. Eish, it's hard. I'm like them. And by saying that statement, like, I'm like them, and not making it up, because obviously in some ways we're not like them. Often what we do is we intentionally try to do it differently, but that can be in a rebellious way. So, and it's still unhealthy. It's not still good, not always good behavior. We're trying to do it so opposite that it makes us, it takes us away from who we really are. So whether we really like them or very, 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 very different from them, in both cases, it's in relation to them. Or in relation to what we don't like in them. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to turn towards them and just be honest and to check in our system and just to feel in ourselves and to feel the places where we resist them and to meet meet that emotion and to allow that emotion to work through our systems so that we can come. And I don't think that this is like a binary thing where you get to a point where all of a sudden, like 100% now you've accepted your parents. I do believe that it's a lifelong journey and that there's always more love and always more acceptance that you can bring, and you can receive. And that's what makes it so exciting. And you can come back to this principle where you recognize they were actually doing the best they could do with what they had at the time. And that's something that I think, people need to really reflect on. It's not always obvious. It's something that you can even grapple with a little bit, and just to say, well, if you don't believe that, if you think that they should have done better, if that's your belief system, well, then go back and investigate what were their conditions, where, see how they grew up, where they came from, what were they exposed to, what made them who they were, because if they could have done differently, if they could have chosen differently, if they could have loved you more, do you really think they wouldn't have? Because we love is a beautiful, we love to love, right? It feels good. So I don't believe anyone wouldn't choose love if they could, because it's such a good thing to choose. It feels so good in our system. So the first movement with Family Constellations is just to accept the parents. I take you, Dad, just as you are. I take you, Mom, just as you are. You were the right mom, you're the right dad for me.
I like what you're saying, because I believe we, at a soul level, for our growth, before we manifest in this realm, we kind of choose the sort of the type of lessons that we want to learn, how we want to grow, how we want to expand. So once one starts looking at life that way, you also eliminate a big chunk of being a victim, because you also look at your parents and say, oh my goodness, look at how coming from perhaps an absent mother or father has influenced your life and allowed you to grow more than your peers, for instance. That can be a good thing for some people. Some people choose to stay stuck in being the victim of that situation and never really growing up and taking responsibility for their own lives. So there's that lens that one can look at it from. But I also think, looking at it, through the lens of family constellations, specifically, one can also learn to extend more compassion to our parents, because you get to see, what did they know? How were they parented? How did they understand love? I think particularly in the Black community, many of our parents grew up being hit a lot.
Yes.
So that's the language they understand in terms of discipline. And then someone in a younger generation might look at it and like, it's abuse, so there's all those kind of things that Family Constellations helps us to look at, right?
Yes, I think it's so well put. Yeah, that's the language they knew, right? So you can't fault them for it. That's because that's just what they knew, that was their language. So that's what they continued. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to connect with the part of them that did love us, even though they abused us. That there's always a part. And that's the thing that I think for me that can be the most healing, is to recognize that even in the most abusive situations, there's still a part that loved. There's still a part that could carry the love forward. Even in adoptions where children were given away, you can still connect with the mother that loved, the part of the mother that loved, because there's always that part that's whole, that's unbroken. That's where we can receive the love, especially in the really abusive situations. And, there we can actually feel it. It's tangible. We can actually feel, they actually did love us, even though they didn't know how to show it.
Or maybe they didn't show it in a way that I would have preferred it.
Yeah. And again, it comes back to the same idea. It's not that we have to let our values go. Like, I don't believe that hitting is a good thing, but in that context, I understand how it can happen. So it's like two different things. Like, we don't want to hit our children. That's a value that many of us would carry. But we can also, like you were saying, have compassion for the parents that didn't know any better. And we don't have to hang on to that victim I'm sure you know the drama triangle, because we just go around from victim to abuser to helper to victim to perpetrator to, we just keep going around that cycle. So we need to actually step out of that, like you were saying, and be willing to go, okay, you can't blame anyone. It's just it's a cycle that happens. And when you step out of it, you can look from a different way. I'm
glad you brought that up to say, there's a part of them that still loves, I recently came to recognize that for myself. And it came when I was reflecting on some of, my own personal relationships and how one can be quick to write people off. And I remembered that because there's a God in us. Everybody has got the God, the light within them. So that love is always there. And I'm so glad you brought that up, because we tend to often see, what we deem as wrong that people have done, hold the judgment and all of that, and forget to see the goodness, because we all inherently have got this goodness within us, right? Yes,
beautiful. I love the way you said that. Beautifully put. Yeah. Exactly. That self doesn't go anywhere. We kind of mistake the condition as something that we have choice about. Like, no, that's a condition. You don't get a choice in that condition. The condition is the condition, but the self, like that you're talking about, that's always there. And you can always access that self. You get a choice what you do with the condition.
So when one talks about re-including, let's just say the perpetrator, how would that look like? And I know it might be a bit difficult to, expand on it, but let's say we are working with a family, and one of the people within the family has done something atrocious and they were excluded as a result of that.
Yeah.
Now we are working on reintegrating that person. How does that look like?
Well, I'd say the first step would be the person who was abused. You'd want to work with that person separately, because there's trauma in the system, right? So, that trauma would need to be processed, and that's not something that you want to do anywhere close to the abuser. So that person needs to discharge the energy from the abuse, and the very various tools to do that. The one that I think works best is somatic experiencing, which is just simply about coming back to the body and trusting that the body knows what to do, and that the body knows how to discharge that energy from the abuse. You can look at nature for that. Like, so for instance, like a buck gets away from a lion. What's the first thing it does? Tremors, right? Like, you see this in like impala and a cheetah. Cheetah chases the impala. The impala gets caught, but then gets away. And then, you see the impala kind of darting off. And the first thing it does when it's safe, because that's the key, when it's safe, you have to introduce safety back to the system and strength back to the system. The first thing it does is there's a whole lot of energy that it needs to discharge. So it tremors. And nature does that naturally. But we've learned to interrupt that movement. We've learned to bypass that so that we don't follow the body. We follow the mind. And so that energy gets stuck in the body. So the first thing we need to do is whoever was abused, and that's a separate issue. And that person, the first point is always to discharge that energy, to deal with the trauma of that abuse. But then on a system level, when the time is right, that's when, you can come back to kind of including the abuser, if it was a family member or outside the family, because even if it's outside the family, that person is now part of the system. So that person, it's not that they need to be given a central place, but they just need to be acknowledged, and they need to be included, but just in a simple way. I see you. So often that's the movement, just to see them. And to see that they have their pain, and to see, that's not your business, but what's behind them is theirs. And you come back to the simple idea, me for me and you for you.
And that's so important, because I imagine within a family unit, if the perpetrator is not seen, if that particular situation is not resolved, it threatens the future. It threatens to repeat itself. somewhere in the future, right?
Yes.
So it is in everybody's interest to kind of resolve the thing.
Definitely, yes. Yes, whatever it is, it's in everyone's interest, but it's a very difficult thing to do because it's uncomfortable for families. I mean, and I think that's true for most families, like when we come together for Christmas gatherings or for birthdays or whatever, often there's a celebration and we have to be happy, but it's not always like that. When we come together as families, there's often tensions. There's often, how many people have told me they dread Christmas because it's hard to be with family. Why is it hard to be with family? Because of these things, because we feel them. When we're together with our families, as much as we might celebrate and have fun, we also feel that togetherness brings something. And often we want to shut off from it. We want to push it away. So I think one thing to acknowledge in family system is that you've got to go slowly and you've got to be patient with people as well, because the predominant tendency is unconsciousness. Like the most family systems are very unconscious. So there's a lot of material that needs to be delicately kind of worked with. And if you have just one or two people waking up, it doesn't mean everyone's going to wake up. Most of the time it's not true. Like it's just so that one person that wakes up in a system becomes a gift. And they just do their little work with the hope that more will follow, but it's slow, it doesn't happen quickly often. It's usually like we have to be very patient.
Sure. I really like that. Any parting words? What would you say to anybody listening to this conversation? Hopefully any person that sort of like feels like they need to rebuild their strength, that feels isolated from their family, that perhaps wants to work on their relationship with deceased parents. I think that's a difficult one because it's often not spoken about as well.
Yeah.
Right? What would you say?
I would say the starting point is always, the simplest thing. Just feel yourself sitting on a chair, and feel the ground beneath you. Feel yourself sitting on a chair, the feet on the ground, and feel what it feels like to be connected to the earth. And to feel that no matter how you are, the earth has got you, like the earth holds you. And then from there, then feel what's behind you, and then without any judgment or any need to change anything, just feel what's behind you. Feel your parents, feel your mom and your dad behind you, and just feel what that feels like. To feel, and you might even bring your parents in front of you, get an image of your dad or your mom first, whichever you feel, and just bring them, whether they have passed or whether they're still with you. You just bring that image of them in front of you. And again, with the feeling of the earth supporting you and you breathing and you sitting on the chair, just notice what happens in the body. That's it. And what you're doing there is a healing movement. And if you feel some emotion, just let the emotion come. And then you swap. If you were doing your mom, you go to your dad. And all you're doing is you're trying to move to a place where you're just simply saying, I see you, mom. I see you, dad. I am your child. And my name is whatever your name is. And I receive life from you. I see you. I receive life from you. And in some way, you might take that just a little bit further. And, if there is anything that you want to leave with them, you might just have that sense that you can also leave what you don't want to take forward. But what you're really taking with them is this life. You're taking the best, you're taking the best of them. So, but the simplest way to do it is just, I see you. I see you. I love you. And whatever words come, I see you. I love you. But before you get to I see you, I love you, maybe there's some emotion there that you've got to work through. So that I see you, I love you is natural. So don't force it. It's a step at a time. And I always feel like with the earth, with that feeling of earth underneath you, much more is possible. And remember your resources. The earth is a resource, but remember whatever resources maybe you've got guides that resource to you, or animal spirits that resource you, or maybe it's just nature that resources you. Remember to call on those resources, because we need resources to do this work. We need to, because those resources strengthen our system, so that it's kind of like food for our system, so that we can face that pain. And also the last thing I would say is that if it gets overwhelming, if it gets too much, then don't push. Like our teachers always say to us, don't push, don't hold back. It's that middle ground. Because if you push, you're not going to go very far because you're going to keep overwhelming yourself and it's going to feel like too much. So when you get to a point where it's to just take your attention, shift it to something that feels like a resource, something that supports you. Go for a walk, take a bath, go for a swim, and then come back to it. Like little steps. You go way further.
I remember one of the things that was critical when I did the constellation with you was remembering to stay humble. So even if you do have anger towards a late parent, remember the sequence and remember that irrespective of what has happened, one has to honor their parents, right? So in dealing with whatever emotions that one is carrying at the time, remembering to go there in humility, right? Which also reminds me that in African traditional practices, when one is speaking to the ancestors, one needs to be very humble.
Beautiful. Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
That's a beautiful way to close, I think. And when we go into a sweat lodge, that's what we do. We kneel down, and in many of the African traditions, right, we're on our knees.
Yes.
And we're remembering to stay small. Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah.
And if anybody wants to connect with you, how can they reach you?
They could go to my website. I can put the website on the show notes, but my name, ryanklette.com.
Okay.
Put my email there if you want to email me. That's easy.
All right. Thank you so much, Ryan, for having this conversation with us. It's been very insightful.
Good. Thank you so much. It's been great to be here.
Thank you for sharing your time with us today. I truly hope you learned something new, felt something, and were inspired to cultivate a more conscious life. I'd love to connect with you, hear your thoughts and story. Please feel free to reach out. Our contact details can be found on montseM.co.za.
You've been listening to another production from Solid Gold Podcasts.